The Force had always warned Luke Skywalker in feelings rather than visions, in pressure behind the eyes and unease in the chest long before disaster took shape. On the night everything could have broken, the warning came softly, like a breath held too long. The jungle around the Jedi Temple slept beneath twin moons, leaves stirring in warm air, scented with damp earth and stone. Inside the stone structure, students dreamed of futures still unwritten. Luke stood alone at the threshold of Ben Solo's quarters, his presence barely disturbing the air, the hum of the Force around his nephew turbulent but not lost. Ben slept restlessly, dark hair damp against his brow, fingers twitching as if gripping something unseen. The Force around him surged and ebbed, not like a storm ready to break, but like a river meeting rocks, searching for a path. Luke felt fear rise in him, sharp and immediate, the echo of old failures and older bloodlines. The shadow was there. It was real. Snoke's touch lingered at the edges of Ben's thoughts, a cold whisper pressing against warmth. For one terrible heartbeat, Luke saw the path the galaxy expected. Fear answered with violence, mistrust answered with fire. He did not ignite his blade. Luke exhaled, grounding himself, letting the panic pass through rather than rule him. The Force responded, steadying, like a hand closing over his shoulder. He stepped fully into the room and sat beside Ben's bed instead of standing above it. The decision was small in motion and infinite in consequence. Luke reached out, not to probe or defend, but to connect. The contact was gentle, an acknowledgement rather than an invasion, and Ben stirred, eyes snapping open, breath hitching as the nightmare released him. Ben Solo woke to find his uncle sitting with him, the familiar presence both comforting and terrifying. For years, Ben had lived under the weight of expectation, every glance from the Jedi students a reminder of who his blood connected him to, every whisper of the Force a test he felt he could never quite pass. The darkness he felt was not hunger or malice. It was anger braided with fear, a resentment born from feeling watched even when alone. Seeing Luke there, calm and unarmed, disarmed something inside him that had been coiled tight for too long. "I know," Luke said quietly before Ben could speak. His voice carried no accusation. "I feel it too." Ben sat up, heart pounding, the echo of Snoke's voice still fading, promising clarity, promising relief from the endless pull. He expected condemnation, perhaps pity. What he saw instead was concern tempered with trust. "You think I'm broken," Ben said, the words bitter, rehearsed in his mind for years. "I think you're struggling," Luke replied, "and that you don't have to do it alone." The Force shifted, subtle but profound. The shadow recoiled, not destroyed, but denied the isolation it needed to grow. Luke stayed until Ben's breathing slowed, until the tremor in his hands eased. He spoke of Anakin without euphemism, of mistakes without myth, of a man who fell because no one had listened soon enough. Ben listened, not as a lesson, but as a confession offered freely. When Luke left, the night felt quieter, the moons brighter, the future less certain and far more open. That was the moment that didn't break. The days that followed did not magically banish Ben's darkness. If anything, it became more visible, brought into the open where it could no longer fester unchecked. Luke altered Ben's training, pairing him with students who challenged rather than deferred, pushing discipline without suppression. Meditation replaced isolation. Conversation replaced silence. The Jedi Temple changed subtly around them, the Force flowing more evenly as honesty replaced fear. Ben struggled. He failed. He lost control in sparring sessions, cracked stone with errant bursts of telekinesis, and walked away from more than one lesson with his jaw clenched and his pride bruised. But he did not run. Each time the anger surged, Luke was there to help him unpack it, not as a master delivering doctrine, but as family refusing to look away. The darkness no longer felt like a secret shame. It became a challenge, one Ben could face without surrendering to it. Far beyond the temple, in a place where light struggled to exist, Snoke felt the resistance, like a sudden pressure against his mind. The boy had not turned. The expected fracture had sealed instead of shattering, and the ripples spread outward through the Force. Snoke's interest sharpened into something colder and more focused. A Skywalker who resisted temptation was not merely a failure of design. He was a threat. Snoke adjusted his approach. The whispers did not cease, but they changed tone. No longer urging violence, they offered understanding, validation, the sense that Ben's anger was justified, that the galaxy had wronged him, that power could be used without surrendering to cruelty. It was a more dangerous lure, one that mirrored Ben's own doubts rather than opposing them. Ben felt it, especially during moments of exhaustion, when the Force pressed heavy and the expectations of two legacies weighed on him from opposite sides. He did not hide it. He told Luke. He told Leia when she visited the temple, her presence grounding and complicated all at once. Mother and son spoke openly, sometimes painfully, about Vader, about the lies of heroism, about the cost of pretending fear did not exist. Leia Organa watched her son with the eyes of a general and a mother, and neither perspective offered comfort. She saw his strength, his compassion, his volatility. She also saw the way senators reacted to his name, how conversations shifted when Skywalker blood entered the room. The New Republic was fragile, built on ideals still untested by true crisis. A powerful Force user tied to the most infamous enforcer in galactic history made politicians nervous, no matter how bright his intentions. Pressure mounted quietly. Leia received reports of unexplained raids beyond known space, of disciplined fleets moving without banners, of ideology spreading faster than resources could explain. The First Order was not yet a name spoken openly, but its shape was forming, and Leia felt it pressing in on all sides. She urged Luke to prepare, to consider that the Jedi might soon be needed not as teachers, but as shields. Luke listened, but he refused to let fear dictate action again. Preparation did not have to mean suspicion. He believed Ben's presence could be an answer rather than a liability, proof that legacy did not define destiny. The Jedi Order he was rebuilding would not repeat the mistakes of the past by confusing control with balance. Ben, for his part, stood at the center of forces he barely understood, feeling the galaxy's attention even when no eyes were on him. He trained harder, not to prove himself, but to understand himself. He learned to sit with discomfort instead of striking against it. He learned that the light side was not the absence of passion, but the discipline to choose compassion even when anger offered faster solutions. Still, doubt lingered. Ben wondered if restraint made him weaker, if refusing the dark side meant conceding ground to enemies who would not hesitate. He watched whole reports of pirate attacks and political deadlock, of systems slipping into chaos, while the Republic debated process over protection. The Force stirred uneasily during those broadcasts, as if echoing his frustration. It was during one such evening that Ben felt the pull again, stronger than before, not from anger, but from purpose. Snoke showed him visions of order imposed swiftly, of wars ended decisively, of suffering prevented by overwhelming strength. The offer was not domination, but efficiency. Ben felt the temptation keenly, not because it appealed to his ego, but because it aligned with his desire to stop pain before it spread. He went to Luke before the vision faded. Their conversation stretched long into the night, the jungle alive around them, insects humming, distant creatures calling to one another beneath the stars. Luke did not dismiss Ben's concerns. He acknowledged the failures of the Republic, the slowness of institutions, the cost of restraint. He also spoke of the difference between preventing suffering and controlling lives, of how easy it was to cross that line without noticing until it was far behind you. Ben listened, absorbing not just the words, but the weight behind them. Luke was not asking him to be perfect. He was asking him to choose, again and again, even when the choice was hard. Elsewhere, agents moved. The Knights of Run gathered strength, sensing the absence of a leader they had been promised. They felt Ben's presence like a beacon denied, and their frustration sharpened into intent. They would find him, test him, claim him, or destroy him. The galaxy was shifting, lines forming where none had existed before, and at the center stood a young man who had refused to become the villain history demanded. The Force watched, patient and vast, as it always had. If you want to see more moments where destiny bends and familiar legends take a different path, hit that subscribe button and drop the name of a character you want to see face the Star Wars galaxy in a new way. The Jedi Temple settled into a rhythm that felt deceptively calm, as if the galaxy itself were holding its breath. Training sessions resumed beneath open skies, lightsabers humming through controlled arcs, the sound echoing off stone and jungle alike. Ben Solo moved among the other students with a presence that was impossible to ignore, not because of arrogance, but because the Force bent slightly around him, responding to his emotions, whether he wanted it to or not. Some students admired him. Others resented him. All of them felt the weight of his lineage, even when he tried to shrug it off. Ben felt it most when he stood alone. Meditation had always been difficult for him, not because he lacked discipline, but because stillness gave his thoughts room to sharpen. When he closed his eyes, the Force did not flow gently like Luke described. It surged, crowded with impressions, echoes of places he had never been and moments that had not yet happened. He sensed conflict before it reached the Hollows, felt fear ripple across distant systems like a tremor beneath his feet. The Jedi taught patience, but patience felt like watching a storm form while being told not to move. Luke adjusted his methods accordingly. Instead of forcing Ben into prolonged silence, he introduced motion into his training, walking meditations through the jungle, exercises that required Ben to anchor himself while in motion, to let emotion exist without allowing it to command action. It was unorthodox, but so was Ben. The Force responded better when he was engaged, when his mind had something to hold onto instead of spiraling inward. Progress came in uneven waves. One day Ben would demonstrate breathtaking control, guiding falling debris away from other students during a structural failure without conscious effort. The next, he would lose focus entirely, frustration snapping outward in a burst that sent training remotes scattering across the yard. Each failure cut deep, reinforcing the quiet fear that he was only one mistake away from becoming what everyone expected him to be. Luke refused to let those moments define him. He spoke openly to the other students, dismantling the unspoken hierarchy that placed Ben apart. He emphasized that power without balance was a liability, not an achievement. Slowly, the atmosphere shifted. Competition softened into cooperation. Ben found himself paired with students who challenged him without fear, who treated him as a peer rather than a threat or idol. Outside the temple, the galaxy did not share that patience. Leia Organa stood in the New Republic Senate chamber, listening to arguments circle endlessly around policy and precedent, while reports of unexplained fleet movements gathered dust in committee archives. She felt the same frustration Ben did, a sense of urgency trapped beneath layers of procedure. Her son's progress at the temple gave her hope, but it also intensified her worry. If conflict came, Ben would be pulled into it whether he was ready or not just as a Jedi, but as a symbol. The name Skywalker carried weight far beyond the Force. To some senators, it represented salvation. To others, instability. Leia navigated those perceptions carefully, defending the Jedi Order's autonomy while resisting calls to weaponize it preemptively. She refused to turn her son into a deterrent, even as subtle pressure mounted to parade him as proof of the Republic's strength. Ben felt that pressure despite the distance. During Leia's visits, he sensed her restraint, the things she chose not to say, the calculations behind her smiles. Their conversations were honest, but never simple. Leia spoke of responsibility in political terms, of consequences that rippled outward from every decision. Ben spoke of responsibility as a personal weight, something that pressed inward, threatening to collapse him if he faltered. "I don't want to be symbol," Ben told her one evening as they stood overlooking the temple grounds, torches flickering against the encroaching dark. "I just want to help." Leia studied him, seeing echoes of Anakin's intensity without the arrogance that had once accompanied it. "Sometimes helping means being seen," she said gently. "And sometimes it means knowing when not to be." Those words lingered with Ben long after she departed. The Force grew more restless as weeks passed. Luke felt it during meditation, a tension threading through distant stars, subtle but persistent. He recognized the pattern too well. Something was organizing. Someone was exerting influence without revealing their hand. Luke suspected Snoke's involvement, though the name still surfaced only in fragmented reports and half-understood force impressions. Whoever he was patient, content to let others underestimate the threat until it was too late. Ben sensed Snoke more clearly than Luke did. The connection was not a bond, but a resonance, like two notes vibrating at similar frequencies. Snoke did not intrude directly. Instead, he observed, testing boundaries, adjusting pressure. Ben felt his presence during moments of doubt, never commanding, always suggesting. The restraint unsettled Ben more than outright manipulation would have. It made refusal feel like a choice rather than an act of defiance, which made the choice harder to sustain. One night, during a routine perimeter sweep, Ben felt a sudden flare in the force that snapped his attention outward. It was brief but sharp, like a blade drawn and sheathed too quickly. Luke felt it too. They exchanged a look, understanding passing between them without words. Something had crossed into the system, something attuned enough to the force to avoid conventional detection. They found the evidence at dawn. The jungle floor near the outer boundary bore scorch marks, faint but deliberate, arranged in patterns that spoke of ritual rather than accident. Ben recognized the sensation immediately, a cold familiarity that sent a shiver through him. The Knights of Run. Luke studied the markings with a frown, the implications settling heavily. The Knights were not Sith, but they were not benign wanderers either. They represented a philosophy that embraced power without restraint, identity forged through violence, and loyalty tested through blood. That they had come this close without engaging meant one thing. They were waiting. Luke convened a council with his senior students, choosing transparency over secrecy. He explained what he knew, what he suspected, and what he did not. He did not single Ben out, but the unspoken focus was clear. The Knights were drawn to power, and Ben was a beacon whether he wished to be or not. Ben listened, jaw tight, anger simmering beneath the surface. Part of him wanted to confront them immediately, to prove that he would not be hunted or claimed. Another part recognized the trap in that impulse. Acting alone, driven by pride or fear, was exactly what Snoke would want. The decision was made to reinforce defenses and increase patrols, not to engage unless necessary. It was a strategic choice, measured and cautious. Ben accepted it outwardly, but internally the frustration built. He felt responsible for the danger they faced, for the way threats seemed to orbit his existence. Training intensified. Luke pushed Ben harder, not physically, but philosophically. He challenged Ben's assumptions about strength and weakness, about leadership and sacrifice. He forced Ben to confront the possibility that restraint was not cowardice, but discipline in its purest form. Ben resisted, argued, questioned, but he did not withdraw. The tension between them became a crucible rather than a fracture. Beyond the temple, the Knights of Run observed. They watched Ben's movements through the Force, studied his reactions, tested the boundaries of his resolve. Their leader, masked and silent, felt both frustration and fascination. Ben Solo was not what they had been promised. He did not burn with hatred or hunger. He burned with conflict, which made him unpredictable. Snoke adjusted again. If Ben would not come willingly, then circumstances would have to force his hand. The opportunity came in the form of a distress signal from a nearby system, a mining colony reporting attacks by unidentified forces. The New Republic dismissed it as piracy, too minor to warrant immediate action. Luke felt otherwise. The force around the signal carried a familiar dissonance, the same cold edge Ben had felt near the temple. Luke proposed a reconnaissance mission, small and discreet. He chose Ben to accompany him, not as bait, but as an equal. The decision was deliberate, a statement of trust, as much as strategy. Ben accepted without hesitation, though the weight of expectation pressed heavily against his chest. As their ship lifted off, breaking through the canopy into open sky, Ben felt the force stretch outward, threads pulling taut toward an unknown confrontation. He did not know if the Knights awaited them or something worse. He only knew that this time he would face it without hiding, without surrendering to fear or fury. The galaxy was testing him, not as a Skywalker destined to fall, but as a Jedi still becoming. The mining colony clung to the edge of its asteroid like an afterthought, a patchwork of durasteel platforms and pressurized tunnels wrapped around raw rock. Its lights flickered unevenly as Luke's ship emerged from hyperspace, the stars snapping back into place with a shudder that Ben felt in his bones. The force here was tense, compressed, as if the vacuum itself were holding a grudge. Fear lingered in the corridors below, sharp and recent, but beneath it ran something colder, more deliberate. They landed without ceremony, engines quieting as emergency crews rushed to secure the pad. The miners were a hard-faced people, accustomed to danger, but unprepared for what had struck them. Luke moved among them with calm authority, his presence easing panic even as he gathered information. Ben followed, senses stretched outward, cataloging impressions the way Luke had taught him. Blaster residue scorched the walls, footprints too light for armored soldiers. The faint echo of the Force distorted, like a voice heard through metal. The attacks had come without warning. No demands. No attempt to seize resources. Just swift, surgical violence aimed at specific locations, control hubs, communications arrays, life support junctions. Whoever had planned it knew exactly where to strike to maximize fear without total destruction. Ben felt a familiar anger rise at the calculated cruelty of it, but he breathed through it, grounding himself in the present. Luke noticed. He always did. A brief nod, a reminder rather than a reprimand. They followed the trail deeper into the colony, descending into maintenance shafts where the hum of machinery drowned out most sound. The force grew sharper with each step, the sensation prickling along Ben's skin. He felt watched, measured, as if something on the other side of the bulkheads was waiting for him to make the first mistake. The ambush came suddenly and not at all. The corridor ahead erupted in motion as figures stepped from shadow, their presence snapping into focus in the Force like knives drawn from hiding. The Knights of Ren did not rush forward. They stood their ground, weapons lowered but ready, their armor matte and scarred, masks unreadable. Their leader tilted his head slightly, attention fixed on Ben with unsettling intensity. Luke ignited his lightsaber, the familiar hum cutting through the stale air. Ben did the same, crimson-red sparks reflecting briefly off the walls before settling into the steady blue glow he had forged himself. The contrast was not lost on anyone present. No one spoke at first. The silence stretched, heavy with unspent violence. "You are not what we were promised," the leader said at last, his voice filtered in calm. "And yet you are exactly what we seek." Ben felt the pull again, stronger now, amplified by proximity. The Knights were not offering temptation in the way Snoke did. They embodied it, power worn openly, identity forged through rejection of restraint. He sensed their curiosity, their hunger, but also their uncertainty. They did not know how to approach him, and that gave him an advantage. "I don't belong to you," Ben said, voice steady despite the storm inside him. The leader's attention flicked briefly to Luke, then back. "No," he agreed. "You belong to no one. That is why you matter." The confrontation escalated without a signal. One moment stillness, the next a blur of motion, as the Knights attacked in coordinated arcs. Luke moved with practiced grace, deflecting strikes and blaster fire with economy and precision. Ben met his opponents head-on, lightsaber singing as he adjusted to their unconventional forms. They did not fight like Sith or Jedi. Their movements were brutal, efficient, focused on overwhelming rather than outmaneuvering. Ben adapted quickly. He used the environment, collapsing support struts to divide the group, redirecting momentum rather than meeting force with force. The anger he felt sharpened his focus without consuming it, channeled through discipline rather than rage. When a knight lunged too aggressively, Ben disarmed him with a swift twist, sending the weapon skidding across the floor instead of striking a killing blow. The restraint did not go unnoticed. The leader engaged Ben directly, their clash sending sparks ricocheting off the corridor walls. The knight's strikes were heavy, fueled by conviction rather than technique. Ben felt the temptation to answer in kind, to let the dark side amplify his strength and end the fight decisively. The thought flashed through his mind unbidden, efficient and seductive. He let it pass. Instead, Ben grounded himself in the Force, drawing clarity rather than fury. He matched the leader's power with control, redirecting blows, exploiting openings created by overcommitment. When the knight faltered, Ben stepped inside the guard and ended the duel with a sharp, controlled strike that severed the weapon's hilt without touching flesh. The knights withdrew almost immediately, retreating into shadow with disciplined precision. There was no pursuit. Luke let them go, sensing that chasing would play into a larger design. As the echoes of their departure faded, the Force relaxed slightly, though the tension did not fully dissipate. The leader's parting words lingered in Ben's mind. Not a threat, a promise. They wanted to see what you'd do, Luke said quietly as they surveyed the aftermath. And now they know. Ben deactivated his lightsaber, hands trembling despite his effort to remain calm. They're not done. No, Luke agreed. Neither are we. The miners emerged cautiously, relief mixing with awe as they took in the scene. Luke spoke with their overseer, offering assurances and practical guidance. Ben stood apart, processing the encounter. He felt exhilaration, fear, and a deeper uncertainty. He had won without surrendering to darkness, but the cost was becoming clearer. Every refusal narrowed his options while raising the stakes. Back aboard the ship, as they prepared to depart, Ben felt a sudden shift in the Force that froze him in place. The sensation was vast and distant, like a presence stretching across light years, acknowledging him fully for the first time. Snoke. There was no voice, no image. Just awareness, heavy and intent. Luke felt it too, his expression tightening as he adjusted course. The mission had confirmed his fears. The threat was no longer abstract. It was organizing, probing, learning. When they returned to the temple, the mood shifted palpably. The other students felt the change, the sense that something had crossed a threshold. Luke gathered them again, sharing what could be shared, preparing them without panic. The Jedi Order was small, but it was no longer hidden. Ben retreated to the meditation chamber, needing space to think. The encounter replayed in his mind, every strike and decision scrutinized. He wondered how long he could keep choosing restraint when the galaxy seemed intent on forcing his hand. He wondered if refusing the dark side would ultimately cost more lives than it saved. The Force did not answer. It rarely did. What Ben did not know was that the Knight's report had already reached Snoke, carried not through technology, but through the Force itself. The conclusion drawn was both troubling and intriguing. Ben Solo was not weak. He was not broken. He was something far more dangerous to carefully laid plans. A Skywalker who would not fall could not be controlled. And so the strategy shifted from corruption to confrontation. The galaxy, already unstable, began to tilt. The Senate chamber on Hosnian Prime was designed to impress, a vast amphitheater of light and space meant to embody unity, transparency, and reason. From above, it looked almost serene, its sweeping curves and floating platforms bathed in soft planetary daylight. From within, it felt very different. Ben Solo sensed the tension the moment he entered. A low hum of unease threaded through the Force, sharper than anything he had felt on the mining colony. This was not fear of violence. This was fear of consequence. Leia Organa stood at the center of it all, composed and unyielding, her presence steady in a room full of people who wished she were less so. She wore the weight of the galaxy the way she always had, straight-backed, eyes clear, refusing to flinch no matter how many stares followed her. To the senators, she was a war hero, a political liability, and an uncomfortable reminder of truths they preferred buried. To Ben, she was simply his mother, and that made standing behind her feel both grounding and unbearable. Luke had not wanted Ben to attend, not because he doubted his ability to remain calm, but because the Force here was thick with emotional undercurrents that could pull even a disciplined Jedi off balance. Ben had insisted. The Knights of Ren were no longer a rumor, and Snoke was no longer a distant whisper. The Jedi could not afford to remain invisible, while the Republic argued itself into paralysis. Leia began, without preamble. She spoke of intelligence reports intercepted beyond the known hyperlanes, of military exercises disguised as pirate suppression, of weapons stockpiled under corporate fronts. She did not name the First Order at first, but the implication was clear. This was not a fringe threat. It was organized, funded, and patient. Murmurs rippled across the chamber. Some senators leaned forward, engaged. Others folded their arms, skeptical or defensive. A few glanced at Ben, recognition flashing across their faces as they connected lineage to warning. The Force reacted to him in small, telling ways, spikes of curiosity, resentment, fear. When Leia finally named the First Order, the reaction was immediate and fractured. Accusations of fear-mongering surfaced, thinly veiled as calls for caution. Demands for proof followed, along with pointed reminders of the cost of militarization. Ben listened, jaw tight, as the debate spiraled into familiar patterns. He had trained for years to master his emotions, but this was a different kind of test. These people were not ignorant. They were choosing comfort over preparedness, procedure over survival. A senator from the core worlds rose, voice smooth and dismissive. He questioned Leia's motives, her history, the influence of her brother's religious order. He did not say Darth Vader's name, but it hovered unspoken, a ghost between sentences. Ben felt it then, the shift inside him. Not anger exactly, but something colder, more dangerous. The urge to speak, to reveal power, to force acknowledgement. He felt Luke's attention brush against his own through the Force, a silent warning. This was not a battlefield. Power used here would echo in ways they could not control. Leia met the senator's gaze without blinking. She dismantled his argument piece by piece, her words precise and relentless. She did not defend her lineage. She did not apologize for it. She reframed it, turning history into evidence, pain into credibility. The chamber grew quieter as she spoke, not because she had convinced everyone, but because she could not be easily dismissed. When the session ended, the outcome was predictably inconclusive. Committees would be formed, investigations authorized, time lost. Leia accepted it with outward calm, but Ben felt the weight settle on her shoulders as they left the chamber. Outside, away from the public eye, the air felt different. The Force loosened slightly, though the tension remained. Leia paused, turning to Ben with a look that held pride and concern in equal measure. "They're afraid of you," she said quietly, "of what you represent." "I didn't say anything," Ben replied. "You didn't need to," she said. "They can feel you, even if they don't understand how." That realization unsettled him more than the debate itself. He had worked so hard to be more than his name, to be defined by choice rather than blood. And yet here, surrounded by politics and perception, lineage mattered more than discipline. Later, in a private meeting room, Luke joined them along with a small circle of trusted allies. Maps flickered to life, showing fragmented intelligence stitched together into an alarming pattern. The First Order was consolidating territory beyond Republic oversight, recruiting aggressively and testing response times. The Knights of Ren were only one arm of a much larger structure. "They're probing for weaknesses," Luke said. "Not just militarily." Ben knew what he meant. The encounter on the asteroid had not been about conquest. It had been about assessment. Snoke was learning how Ben fought, how he chose, where his limits lay. "They won't try to turn me again," Ben said, the certainty settling in his chest. "They'll try to make me choose between bad options." Leia looked at him sharply. "You don't have to face this alone." "I know," he said, "but they'll make it about me anyway." The meeting ended with more questions than answers. As the others dispersed, Ben remained behind, staring at the star map. Each glowing point represented lives, systems, choices that would ripple outward. He felt the familiar pull of responsibility tighten around him, not as a burden imposed by prophecy, but as a consequence of awareness. That night, as Ben meditated, the Force shifted again. This time, the presence was closer, more deliberate. The space around him seemed to fold inward, sound fading until only the steady rhythm of his breath remained. When the voice came, it was calm, resonant, and impossibly intimate. "You stand at the center of a storm you refuse to acknowledge," Snoke said. There was no image, no location, just presence layered over presence. "You believe restraint is strength, that denying yourself power is virtue." Ben did not answer immediately. He steadied himself, anchoring his awareness. "Power taken without cost is a lie." A ripple of amusement passed through the Force. "Everything has a cost," Snoke replied. "The question is who pays it." Images pressed at the edges of Ben's perception. Fleets burning. Worlds falling silent. Faces he did not know, but felt responsible for nonetheless. Snoke did not threaten him. He did not demand allegiance. He simply presented inevitability. "You will be forced to choose," Snoke continued, "between victory and purity, between saving those you love and preserving the ideals that will fail them." The connection broke as abruptly as it had formed. Ben opened his eyes, pulse racing. Sweat beaded along his temples, his control hard-won but intact. He had not yielded, but he had seen the shape of the trap being laid. When dawn came, Luke found him already awake, gaze fixed on the horizon. The master said nothing at first, simply sat beside him, sharing the silence. "They're trying to isolate you," Luke said eventually, "to make you think this is yours alone to carry." Ben nodded. "It isn't," he said, "but they'll act like it is." Luke studied him, seeing not a frightened student, but a young man standing at a crossroads no one should have to face. "The Jedi Order failed once because we tried to be something separate from the galaxy, above it. You won't make that mistake." Ben met his eyes. "Neither will you." As they stood together, the Force flowed around them, unsettled but alive. The galaxy was moving toward conflict, whether the Senate acknowledged it or not. And at its heart stood a Skywalker who had not fallen, whose very existence disrupted designs laid decades in advance. That disruption would not be forgiven easily. The Knights of Ren did not announce themselves again. They did not raid another colony or leave symbols burned into metal. They simply began to appear at the edges of conflict, wherever uncertainty and resentment already simmered. Luke felt their movements like pressure changes in the Force, subtle but unmistakable. Ben felt them more acutely, a constant awareness like a distant ache that flared whenever their path bent closer to his own. They were no longer scouting him. They were shaping the galaxy around him. Reports filtered in through channels that rarely agreed on anything. A smuggler enclave on the edge of wild space fractured overnight, its leadership killed and replaced by enforcers who preached strength through severed ties. A Force-sensitive cult on an ocean world abandoned its pacifist doctrine and armed itself, claiming revelation from warriors who had shown them the truth of survival. None of these events could be traced cleanly back to the Knights, but the pattern was undeniable. They were gathering followers not through ideology, but through disillusionment. Luke convened a council at the temple, small by necessity, but heavy with implication. The Jedi students listened as he laid out what little could be confirmed. The Knights of Ren were not Sith. They did not answer to the rule of two. They were not an army, but they were becoming one, bound not by hierarchy, but by shared rejection of restraint. They believed the Force was meant to be used fully, without apology or balance. Ben recognized the danger immediately. It was not just that they were powerful. It was that their message would resonate with those who felt abandoned by the Republic's endless deliberation and the Jedi's careful distance. The Knights did not offer order or chaos. They offered agency without guilt. "We should confront them directly," one of the students said, frustration edging his voice. "Let people see what they really are." "And if they do?" Luke asked gently. "If people choose them anyway?" Silence followed. The question lingered uncomfortably. Ben spoke before he had fully decided to. "They're not trying to replace the Jedi," he said. "They're trying to make us irrelevant." Luke studied him closely. "Explain." "They don't need everyone to follow them," Ben continued. "They just need enough to make people doubt us." to make restraint look like weakness. If the galaxy believes power should be taken whenever possible, then the Jedi way becomes an obstacle instead of a safeguard. Luke nodded slowly, which means this isn't just a military problem. No, Ben agreed. It's philosophical. The decision to act came quickly after that. Waiting would only allow the Knights to deepen their influence. Luke chose a measured response, dispatching small teams to investigate disturbances and offer aid where possible. Ben volunteered for one of these missions without hesitation. He did not say it aloud, but everyone understood why. The Knights were circling him, and the sooner he met them on his own terms, the better. The destination was a forgotten trade hub near the Mid-Rim, a place where Republic oversight was light and survival depended on adaptability. By the time Ben arrived, the situation was already unstable. Local security forces had splintered, some aligning themselves with a charismatic figure who promised protection without rules. The force around him buzzed with volatility, emotions flaring and receding like faulty power currents. Ben moved through the streets openly, lightsaber visible but inactive. He wanted to be seen, to remind people that the Jedi still existed beyond rumor. Reactions were mixed. Some watched with hope, others with suspicion, and a few with open hostility. The Knights' influence had already taken root. He found them at dusk, gathered in the ruins of an old customs hall. They did not attack him. They welcomed him. The leader stepped forward, mask removed this time, revealing a face lined not with corruption but conviction. "You came alone," he said. "That matters." "I didn't come to join you," Ben replied. "We know," the leader said calmly. "If you had, you wouldn't have needed to come at all." They spoke at length, words circling each other like fighters testing range. The Knights did not deny their actions. They framed them differently. They spoke of systems left to rot while the Republic debated, of people crushed under the weight of laws written light years away, of force sensitives abandoned because they did not fit neatly into Jedi doctrine. "You were given place," the leader said. "Most aren't. You're powerful enough to survive restraint. Others aren't. Why should they suffer because of ideals that don't protect them?" Ben felt the argument strike close to something raw. He had seen the Republic's failures firsthand. He had felt the frustration of being told to wait while threats grew. The Knights were not wrong about the problem. They were wrong about the solution. "Power without responsibility isn't freedom," Ben said. "It's just another kind of control." The leader smiled faintly. "That's easy to say when you've never been powerless." The exchange ended without violence, but not without consequence. When Ben left the customs hall, he knew he had been weighed and measured again. The Knights had not tried to defeat him. They had tried to understand him. And worse, they had tried to justify themselves to him. The true cost of the encounter became clear days later. The charismatic figure Ben had come to confront did not flee or repent. Instead, he doubled down, openly aligning with the Knights and daring the Republic to intervene. The situation escalated into open conflict, forcing the Jedi to choose between intervention and escalation. Either path played into the Knights' narrative. Ben watched the holofeeds with a growing sense of unease. Every decision carried unintended consequences. The Knights thrived on this ambiguity, on forcing choices where no option was clean. Snoke reached out again that night, his presence slipping into Ben's awareness with practiced ease. There was no malice in it, no threat, only observation. "You see now," Snoke said. "They follow strength because strength delivers. Ideals do not stop fleets." "They don't have to," Ben replied. "People do." Snoke's amusement was unmistakable. People follow power. They always have. The connection faded, leaving Ben alone with his thoughts. He understood the trap more clearly now. The Knights of Run were not meant to replace him or destroy him. They were meant to surround him with proof that his way would fail. Every world lost to their influence would be another weight added to his conscience. When Ben returned to the temple, Luke sensed the shift immediately. Not corruption, but fatigue. The kind that came from carrying too many unresolved questions. "They're forcing you to react," Luke said. "They're forcing everyone to. Ben replied. "And they're winning ground without firing a shot." Luke did not argue. He had lived through an era where inaction had been as deadly as aggression. "Then we adapt," he said, "without becoming what we're fighting." Ben nodded, though uncertainty lingered. The Knights of Ren were no longer just adversaries. They were a mirror held up to the Jedi, reflecting every flaw, every hesitation. And somewhere beyond them, Snoke watched patiently, adjusting his design. The galaxy was no longer waiting to see if Ben Solo would fall. It was waiting to see how much he would sacrifice to keep from doing so. The first open clash between the Jedi and the First Order did not begin with blaster fire or starfighter wings screaming through vacuum. It began with relief ships, a frontier system that had spent years petitioning the Republic for aid after repeated pirate raids finally received an answer. But the vessels that arrived bore unfamiliar transponder codes and crews that spoke the language of protection with unsettling confidence. They distributed food, repaired infrastructure, and quietly replaced local defense leadership. By the time the Republic realized what had happened, the system had declared itself autonomous, its new rulers openly aligned with the First Order. Luke recognized the move for what it was. Not conquest, but legitimacy. The First Order was building loyalty by doing what the Republic could not or would not do quickly enough. Ben felt the same cold understanding settle in his chest. This was Snoke's design unfolding in real time, turning patience into a weapon. The Jedi were asked to intervene, not as peacekeepers, but as symbols. Their presence alone would challenge the First Order's claim to authority. Luke hesitated, knowing the risk. Sending Jedi into a politically charged environment could ignite the very conflict they sought to prevent. But doing nothing would allow the narrative to harden. Ben volunteered before the discussion could stall. He framed it carefully, not as eagerness for confrontation, but as necessity. He understood the stakes better now. The Knights of Ren had already softened the ground. The First Order was planting its banner. The system was deceptively calm when Ben arrived. Streets were clean, power grid stable. Citizens went about their lives with a cautious optimism he had not seen in many Republic-aligned worlds. The Force reflected this surface peace, but beneath it ran a tight current of suppressed anxiety. Order imposed too quickly always carried a cost. He met the First Order's regional commander in a public forum, flanked by stormtroopers whose armor gleamed with deliberate symbolism. They did not threaten Ben. They thanked him for coming. They spoke of cooperation, of shared goals, of stability. Every word was crafted to make refusal seem unreasonable. "You Jedi claim to serve the people," the commander said, voice amplified across the square. "So do we. The difference is we act." Ben felt eyes on him from every direction. This was not a duel. This was theater. "Acting without accountability isn't service," Ben replied evenly. "It's occupation." The crowd shifted, murmurs rippling outward. The commander smiled, unbothered. "Then let the people decide," he said. "Stay. Observe. See for yourself." Ben accepted, knowing the trap. Refusal would paint the Jedi as distant and elitist. Staying would legitimize the First Order's presence. Snoke's philosophy echoed in his mind. Everything has a cost. As days passed, Ben saw the cracks beneath the Order. Dissenters quietly detained. Resource distribution favoring those who pledged loyalty. Children encouraged to join security programs that mirrored indoctrination more than training. The people were safer, but less free. Many accepted the trade willingly. The Knights of Ren arrived on the 5th day, their presence unannounced but unmistakable. They did not confront Ben directly. They moved through the city like rumors made flesh, speaking to the disillusioned, the ambitious, the angry. The force around them grew heavier, charged with possibility and resentment. Ben confronted them that night on a high platform overlooking the city. The leader regarded him with something like respect. "You see it now," he said. "The galaxy doesn't want guardians. It wants results." "And what happens when your results require cruelty?" Ben asked. The leader's expression hardened. Cruelty is a word used by those who don't bear responsibility. The conversation ended when First Order forces intervened, not to protect Ben, but to assert control. Lines were being drawn, and subtlety was giving way to inevitability. The confrontation came at dawn. A protest turned violent when security forces attempted to arrest a group of dissenters. Ben moved instinctively, deflecting blaster fire, shielding civilians, de-escalating where he could. The crowd saw it all. A Jedi standing between them and oppression. The First Order responded swiftly, not with overwhelming force, but with accusation. They broadcast footage edited to show Ben as the instigator, the catalyst for unrest. By nightfall, the system's leadership formally requested his departure for the sake of stability. Ben left, but not before sending everything he had gathered back to Leia. Proof, context, patterns. It was enough to sway some, not enough to force action. When he returned to the temple, the weight of the failure pressed heavily on him. He had done everything right, and it had not been enough. Luke felt it, the quiet erosion of certainty that came not from doubt, but from experience. They're redefining victory, Luke said, making it about optics, not justice. And they're better at it, Ben replied. Snoke's presence brushed against him again, stronger this time, threaded with something like satisfaction. You protect individuals, Snoke said. I shape eras. Ben did not respond. He understood now that Snoke was not offering temptation. He was offering inevitability, the idea that the galaxy would move toward his vision regardless of resistance, and that Ben's refusal to embrace greater power would only make the transition bloodier. That night, Ben walked the temple grounds alone. He did not rage. He did not despair. He listened. The force was vast, conflicted, alive. It did not demand domination. It demanded engagement. The choice before him was no longer between light and dark. It was between tradition and evolution, between a Jedi Order that reacted and one that anticipated. When dawn came, Ben sought out Luke with a proposal that would change everything. Not an abandonment of Jedi principles, but a redefinition of their application. Jedi who would embed themselves within systems, not above them, who would act early, transparently, and politically as well as spiritually. Luke listened in silence. When Ben finished, the older man smiled, weary but proud. You're not running from the shadow, he said. You're learning how to stand in it. The galaxy was accelerating toward conflict. The First Order tightening its grip. The Knights of Run growing bolder. Snoke weaving patience into power. And Ben Solo, who never fell, was preparing to meet them not as a weapon, but as a catalyst. Ben Solo's next mission took him to the Mid-Rim, to a planet long overlooked by the Republic and largely ignored by the Jedi. Varelia. The world was a patchwork of deserts and scrubland, dotted with small settlements that survived on trade, smuggling, and resource extraction. By all conventional measures, it was insignificant. But significance was relative. The First Order had already embedded themselves here, quietly influencing trade guilds, local militias, and even the Planetary Council. Ben's task was simple in description, but impossible in practice. Assess, contain, and neutralize the First Order's influence without sparking open rebellion or civilian casualties. He landed in the capital city at twilight, the twin suns of Varelia dipping low, casting long shadows across cracked streets and half-repaired buildings. A breeze carried the scent of dust, sweat, and oil from the industrial outskirts. The Force told him more than any official report could. Fear was tightly wound into the populace, but so was hope. They had seen what the First Order could offer: protection, stability, and decisive action. But they had also begun to recognize the cost. Ben moved through the city with deliberate visibility. His robes were simple, unadorned, his lightsaber sheathed. The citizens did not approach openly, but eyes followed him from doorways and alleyways, assessing whether he represented hope or more danger. A child tripped over his sandals and looked up at him with wide eyes, mouth open as if to ask a question. Ben crouched, offering a brief nod and a smile before moving on. Every small gesture carried weight here. Every perception could tip the delicate balance of influence. The First Order was already aware of his arrival. Sniper teams, informants, and local enforcers reported movement patterns directly to their command structure. Ben felt them through the Force, the subtle ripple of presence that was both calculated and cautious. They did not attack immediately. Their strategy was patient. They were not here to fight. They were here to provoke, to test the Jedi's resolve and influence public perception. Ben's first confrontation came in the form of a council meeting. Local leaders had been convened under the guise of discussing trade regulations, but it was clear the First Order had orchestrated the agenda. Ben observed from the back, sensing the subtle manipulations, the subtle nudges of suggestion, the veiled threats cloaked as civic duty. When a councilman suggested aligning openly with the First Order to ensure the planet's survival, others hesitated, caught between fear and pragmatism. Ben's presence alone was a counterbalance, though he remained quiet, allowing the debate to reveal itself. Afterward, he approached the local militia commander, a wiry man with cautious eyes. "You are being guided," Ben said softly, "by people whose goals are not yours. They promise security, but it is a cage." The commander's fingers twitched near the blaster at his side. "You don't understand. They pay better. They protect us from raids. They give us equipment. They also demand loyalty, obedience, and silence," Ben said. "The cost is higher than you realize. Look at the systems already under their influence. Do you want Varelia to become the next?" The commander studied him, weighing words against fear. Finally, he nodded slightly, not out of surrender, but acknowledgement. Ben understood that this was not victory. It was planting a seed, a subtle shift. In the larger scheme, incremental influence mattered. Patience was a weapon as potent as any lightsaber. Later that night, the Knights of Ren arrived. Unlike the previous encounter, they did not hide. They materialized in the city outskirts, in positions that were almost ceremonial, as if signaling both presence and restraint. Ben felt their intention immediately, challenge without outright engagement. The leader, masked as ever, approached through the shadows. "You are cautious," the voice said. "I can respect that. But caution alone does not prevent collapse." "I am not here to prevent collapse," Ben replied. "I am here to minimize it, to protect as much as possible without giving in to fear or power hunger." The leader's laughter was low, almost approving. "You think yourself measured, disciplined, and yet you follow rules that do not exist for everyone. Some will not wait for the Jedi to act. Some will choose what they believe is necessary. And some will choose poorly," Ben said. "And I will be there to correct it without becoming what they are." The knights watched silent, their presence filling the streets like a dark fog. Ben sensed the tension their arrival caused among civilians. Fear, curiosity, respect. He also sensed cracks within the knights themselves, discipline not fully hardened, moments of doubt, undercurrents of individuality restrained by ideology. They were formidable, but not flawless. The true test came when a shipment of weapons meant for local militia units, officially sanctioned, but influenced by First Order advisors, was intercepted by Ben. He navigated the city's rooftops, silent and precise, disabling transports, removing weapons, and leaving subtle messages of warning for those involved. No lives were lost, but the action was visible enough to disrupt First Order planning and signal to locals that they had allies who acted without promise of reward. The next day, the First Order's regional commander confronted him. "You cannot stop what is already in motion," the man said. "Every act you take simply exposes you further and emboldens others who might doubt your Jedi ideals." Ben met the commander's gaze evenly. "I do not stop what is in motion. I choose what to protect." Words hung between them. Power and perception clashed in subtle, non-violent ways. The commander left, seething, aware that the presence of Ben Solo, a Jedi unfallen, resolute, and tactically astute, had undermined years of careful preparation. That night, in meditation, Ben sensed Snoke again. This time, the presence was closer, tighter, probing for cracks. "You act with restraint," the voice said. "Yet the galaxy does not reward restraint. You will have to bend or break to influence it. I will not bend into tyranny, Ben replied, the Force coursing around him, steadying him. Influence does not require oppression. Protection does not require fear. Snoke's presence lingered, a reminder of inevitability and observation. Ben understood now that every mission, every choice, every measured act of restraint was part of a larger pattern that Snoke sought to exploit. The First Order was not just building power. It was building narrative. Every delay, every hesitation, every ethical choice could be twisted, reframed, or weaponized against those who resisted. Ben Solo had never faced an enemy quite like this. Not brute strength, not overwhelming firepower. The enemy was subtle, patient, and adaptive. It leveraged ideology, perception, and human weakness, and it was entwined with the destiny he carried in his blood. The stakes were larger than personal mastery or even the survival of individual systems. They were about shaping the galaxy's understanding of morality, leadership, and the use of power itself. When he left Varelia, the situation was not resolved. The First Order still had influence. The Knights of Run remained in the shadows, ready to test him again. And the galaxy's perception of the Jedi as effective guardians had shifted slightly, imperceptibly perhaps, but enough to matter. Ben returned to the temple with a new clarity. The fight ahead would not be decided by lightsabers alone. It would be fought through patience, diplomacy, tactical brilliance, and moral courage. And above all, he knew that every action he took, no matter how careful, would be scrutinized, manipulated, and potentially misunderstood by those he sought to protect. He was no longer just a Jedi. He was a symbol, a mirror, and a challenge to forces both visible and unseen. And he would need every ounce of focus, strength, and insight to prevent the galaxy from slipping into a path shaped not by justice, but by fear and impatience. Ben Solo returned to the Mid-Rim, this time not to a single planet, but to a cluster of systems already feeling the silent influence of the First Order and the subtle, insidious presence of the Knights of Run. His journey was marked by tense hyperspace jumps through lightly patrolled sectors, each route fraught with the possibility of encountering unprepared local militias under First Order guidance or desperate smugglers willing to sell information about Jedi movements to the highest bidder. The galaxy was changing, and it was moving faster than any single person could anticipate. Every system he visited seemed to exist in its own moral gray zone, a patchwork of loyalty and opportunism, fear and pragmatism. And Ben realized the real battle would not be fought with weapons, but with judgment. He first arrived on a world known as Thauros, a mining planet with harsh terrain and harsher people. The locals had been pacified not by the Jedi, but by the promise of consistent work and security under First Order oversight. Ben moved through the industrial hubs carefully, sensing the currents of obedience and resentment alike. The Force whispered of the Knight's recent visit. 3 figures had walked through the city weeks before, speaking to the miners in quiet but powerful ways. The people had been unsettled, confused, inspired, and manipulated, all at once. Ben understood that direct confrontation would be futile. He would need to employ strategy, subtlety, and perception management. He began by seeking out leaders who were already wary of the First Order's subtle control. These were the small councils that operated within the mining complexes, representatives of miners' unions who had quietly resisted the imposed mandates. Ben spoke to them not as a Jedi demanding allegiance, but as an observer offering insight. He shared what he had seen on neighboring systems, explaining the risks of allowing external forces to dictate local law under the guise of protection. They call it stability, Ben said, but stability without freedom is just another form of control. You are capable of managing your own lives if you choose to act together. The leaders were hesitant. They had been taught to fear external power, but Ben's calm presence, combined with the subtle but undeniable projection of the Force, allowed them to believe that they could take small steps without immediate risk. By the time he left Thauros, minor acts of resistance had begun, a refusal to share resources with the First Order, covert protection of dissenters, and discreet organization of local militias ready to defend the planet if necessary. Meanwhile, Intelligence reached him about the Knights of Run. They had appeared on a nearby system, not in force, but as symbols of power, gathering disaffected youth and marginalized groups, convincing them that action without consequence was possible. Ben felt their presence through the Force, a taut wire of intention and purpose. The Knights were not violent for the sake of violence. They were deliberate, using ideology and the natural frustrations of populations to grow influence. Every decision Ben made seemed mirrored by their subtle manipulations elsewhere, an omnipresent threat without the need for direct confrontation. The next system was Vasca, a port world famous for its labyrinthine canals and organized crime syndicates. Here, Ben's approach had to change. The First Order had made no secret of their influence. Local crime lords had been given authority and resources to maintain control, ensuring compliance without overt military presence. Ben could feel the tension in the Force. The population was compliant, but simmering undercurrents of fear and loyalty to criminal overlords had been carefully balanced by the external pressure of First Order guidance. He did not attempt to confront the criminal leaders directly. Instead, he observed, studied patterns, and used subtle nudges. One evening, he visited a bustling dockside, and with careful use of the Force, redirected shipments of illicit arms away from systems where unrest was likely to spark. He left messages for local law enforcement indicating the actions of the First Order backgangs, carefully avoiding blame for the interference. Slowly, the balance began to shift. Those willing to oppose oppression found confidence in the Jedi's quiet intervention, while those loyal to the First Order began to second-guess the absolute nature of their authority. Even as he worked, he remained aware of the Knights' attention. They did not move in the open, but Ben could sense their planning, their quiet conversations among themselves through the Force, the whispers of their collective intention. One night, atop the highest tower in Vasca's central port, he confronted them directly. "You continue to interfere," one of the masked figures said, voice low and calm. "Why?" "Because influence without guidance leads to suffering," Ben replied. "Because your power is being used to manipulate, not protect." The figure tilted its head, considering. Protection is not always desired. People follow strength willingly. You offer ideals they do not understand. You offer restraint when action is needed. That is why we act, and you hesitate. Ben met the gaze of the figure through the Force, resisting the subtle pull of seduction in the words. He understood their philosophy. He even understood the temptation, but he could not accept it. He had witnessed the cost of unchecked power and the destruction of morality disguised as pragmatism. "Power alone is meaningless," he said. "The Force binds life together, not because it demands obedience, but because it connects. Without responsibility, power becomes ruin." For a moment, silence hung between them, a taut line stretched across the night air. Then, the figure stepped back, signaling the others to withdraw. They did not leave, not entirely, but retreated into shadows, leaving Ben with the uneasy satisfaction that this encounter had ended without violence. Yet he knew it was only temporary. The Knights were patient, and he could not assume their withdrawal meant surrender. Days later, Ben's efforts were disrupted when a coordinated sabotage campaign struck 3 systems he had just influenced. Supply chains were cut, local militias attacked from within, and rumors circulated that Jedi interference had caused instability. Ben realized that the First Order had begun a counter-narrative, turning public perception against him. He acted swiftly. Using the Force, he located the sources of sabotage, guided local leaders in coordinated defenses, and personally intervened to protect civilian lives. His actions were visible but calculated, demonstrating competence and authority without inciting panic. The public response began to shift again, seeing the Jedi as a stabilizing presence rather than a remote enforcer. Yet through all of this, the Knights of Run remained a constant presence, subtle but oppressive. Ben sensed their strategy evolving, exploiting every weakness, testing his patience, and challenging his understanding of balance. They were not just warriors, they were ideological architects, shaping perception and consequence in ways that mirrored the Force itself, unpredictable, powerful, and always present. Returning to the temple after these missions, Ben felt both exhaustion and clarity. The galaxy was not a place where ideals alone would prevail. It was a complex web of perception, influence, and subtle power. To oppose the First Order and the Knights of Run required not just mastery of the Force, but mastery of strategy, empathy, and judgment. Each choice carried consequence. Each action would ripple across worlds, and the margin for error was vanishingly small. He met Luke in the meditation chamber, voice quiet but firm. "It's no longer about confrontation," Ben said. "It's about influence, about shaping outcomes without becoming the thing we oppose." Luke nodded. "You've learned more than I could have hoped. But remember, influence can be corrupted if wielded without integrity. Balance is not compromise, it is discipline." Ben understood. The fight ahead would test not only his skill as a Jedi, but his understanding of morality, leadership, and responsibility. He had never fallen to the dark side, but the choices before him were no less dangerous. And the galaxy, ever impatient and ever hungry for clarity, would judge the results harshly. He prepared once more for departure. Systems awaited his intervention, each with its own complex web of power and perception. And always, the presence of the knights lingered in the shadows, waiting for misstep, testing patience, and shaping the outcome of events without a single strike. Ben Solo was no longer a student. He was a sentinel, a strategist, and a symbol. The Knights of Run and the First Order had underestimated him, but he knew their reach was long, and their patience infinite. This war would not be decided in battles alone, but in influence, foresight, and moral courage, and Ben intended to meet it on every front. The culmination of Ben Solo's efforts arrived sooner than he expected. Intelligence reports indicated that the First Order had chosen to consolidate several mid-rim systems into a single, tightly controlled network. This would create a strategic stronghold capable of funneling resources, personnel, and propaganda into multiple star systems, solidifying their influence and leaving the Republic scrambling to respond. Ben realized that subtlety alone would not be enough. Direct intervention was required, but not in the form of an all-out assault. He needed to strike decisively, demonstrate the Jedi's presence and power, and create a disruption that could not be spun into a narrative of failure. The target system was Garviel, a planet of vast plains, mining colonies, and one major city that had become the administrative hub for First Order operations. Arrival was tense. The Force thrummed with anticipation, a mixture of fear, loyalty, and latent rebellion. The Knights of Run were already present, visible now in their ceremonial positions across the urban landscape, signaling both dominance and control. Ben landed at a small, neutral airstrip on the outskirts of the city, choosing to approach under the radar and maintain the element of surprise. He moved through the city in the early morning hours, careful to avoid patrols, but aware that local inhabitants were watching. Each step was measured, each interaction deliberate. He sought out those who had resisted First Order influence, guiding them in subtle ways to coordinate defenses, gather information, and protect civilians. His presence began to inspire courage, but he knew the balance was precarious. Too much visibility could provoke the First Order. Too little would allow their control to solidify. Ben's first confrontation came at a communications hub. The facility had been secured by First Order personnel, with droids and guards monitoring transmissions. Using a combination of stealth and the Force, he bypassed security, infiltrated the control room, and began redirecting communications. Messages intended to control or intimidate civilians were intercepted, while warnings to loyalists were sent covertly to prepare them for coordinated action. Each move required precise timing, and Ben felt the strain of managing multiple threads of influence simultaneously. The Knights of Run observed these actions, and he could sense their response. They did not engage directly, but their presence was felt across the city, a pressure on the populace that complicated his efforts. Ben used this tension to his advantage, turning the Knights' intimidation into a tool. Civilians and local resistance fighters interpreted the quiet but visible demonstration of Jedi skill as protection rather than threat. The Force amplified their perception of hope, creating pockets of resistance that could act in concert without triggering mass retaliation. The climax of the operation occurred at the Central Administrative Tower. The First Order had gathered leadership and key resources within its highest floors, and the building itself was a symbol of control. Ben infiltrated from multiple angles, disabling security systems and quietly neutralizing patrols. Civilians were evacuated where possible, and local leaders were guided to positions of safety. His lightsaber remained sheathed for most of the operation, drawn only when necessary to disarm and subdue guards without unnecessary violence. Inside the tower, Ben confronted the First Order Regional Commander. The man was calm, confident, and fully aware of the stakes. "You cannot stop this," he said. "Every act you take is temporary. The galaxy will bend to order." "And every act you take will be judged," Ben replied. "Power without accountability is not stability, it is tyranny." They clashed briefly, but not as enemies in a duel. The confrontation was more symbolic than violent, a battle of ideology and presence rather than brute force. Ben used the Force to disable security systems, redirect guards, and secure sensitive information, all while minimizing harm. The commander, realizing he was outmaneuvered strategically rather than physically, surrendered control to prevent further loss of life, though he made no promises of loyalty. Outside, the Knights of Run moved to intervene, but Ben anticipated their approach. Using speed, precision, and the environment to his advantage, he created controlled distractions, rerouted civilians, and subtly guided the perception of their actions so that the populace would see them as threats rather than conquerors. The result was a complex, orchestrated disruption that destabilized the First Order's network without unnecessary bloodshed. By the end of the day, the operation was complete. Key communications and resources had been secured, local resistance was stronger, and the First Order's influence had been disrupted across multiple systems. Civilians, who had initially feared intervention, now saw the Jedi as protectors capable of decisive action. The Knights of Run retreated to reassess, their strategy frustrated by Ben's combination of subtlety and decisive action. Ben returned to his ship that evening, exhausted but clear in purpose. He understood that this was not the end of the First Order's advance, nor the limit of the Knights' capabilities. The battle had been won, but the war for influence, perception, and the soul of the galaxy would continue. He had proven that restraint, strategy, and moral courage could disrupt even a powerful and patient adversary. But he also knew that every victory carried consequences and required vigilance. In the quiet of the cockpit, he reflected on the complexity of leadership and the weight of choice. The First Order would continue to adapt, and the Knights of Run would test him at every turn. The galaxy itself was not a static entity. It responded to action, inaction, and perception in ways that were subtle but profound. Ben Solo, who had never fallen, realized that his path was not about defeating a single enemy, but about guiding the galaxy's potential toward a balance that respected freedom, responsibility, and the Force itself. The aftermath of the Garvial operation rippled across the galaxy with a subtle but undeniable force. Reports of the First Order's destabilized networks and the mysterious Jedi intervention spread quickly among both sympathetic and hostile systems. Unlike previous confrontations, this one had left a clear message. The Jedi were not passive observers, and a single figure, Ben Solo, could alter the course of events with precision and restraint. Across the mid and outer rim systems, communities previously cowed by fear found renewed courage. Resistance cells that had operated in secret now felt emboldened to act, coordinating strikes and sharing intelligence in ways they never had before. Ben knew that maintaining this momentum would be crucial, but he also understood the delicate balance he needed to strike between influence and autonomy. Back on the New Republic's rebuilt capital, senators debated what to do with this newfound intelligence. Several argued for immediate engagement with Ben Solo, fearing that an unchecked Jedi presence could undermine governance or lead to independent military actions. Others, however, recognized the strategic advantage of a Jedi acting as a stabilizing force, especially one capable of influencing both civilians and former First Order operatives without resorting to wholesale destruction. The debate reflected a tension Ben understood well. Power in the galaxy was not measured solely in ships or armies, but in trust perception, and the ability to guide choices without forcing them. Meanwhile, the Knights of Run had retreated to regroup and re-strategize. They had not been defeated, but the moral clarity and tactical brilliance of Ben's actions had challenged their cohesion. Each member wrestled with his refusal to embrace the dark side, the Jedi Code, or the conventional logic of power. Internal disagreements surfaced, and the group's leader, sensing a shift in influence, considered whether blind loyalty to the First Order was still the optimal path. The Knight's instability would soon become an opportunity for Ben, not to dominate, but to redirect. The battle for perception extended beyond the Republic and First Order. Independent systems, mercenary syndicates, and neutral factions began to take notice. Smugglers adjusted their routes to account for Jedi oversight. Merchants recalibrated negotiations to avoid sudden interference, and bounty hunters reconsidered their loyalties. Ben had not declared war, yet his actions created a new equilibrium. He had intervened decisively, but with restraint, demonstrating both strength and restraint. The galaxy was watching, learning that a Jedi could operate outside the extremes of fear or fanaticism, embodying an alternative path to order and justice. Among those directly affected were former First Order soldiers who had observed Ben's restraint. Some began questioning their purpose and allegiance. For the first time, they saw that obedience without reflection was not the only path, and that the Jedi's influence could manifest not as oppression, but as guidance and moral clarity. Quiet defections and covert aid to resistance groups began to increase, a phenomenon that Ben anticipated but did not force. His victory was not measured in territory or prisoners, but in the subtle expansion of choice across the galaxy. Ben also had to contend with the Force itself. The Force had shifted subtly in response to his actions, revealing potential outcomes and hidden currents of influence. He sensed threads of darkness and corruption lingering in systems recently liberated, as well as emerging pockets of hope that could flourish if nurtured. Each decision he made in response required patience, foresight, and moral deliberation. The galaxy's balance was fragile. Small actions could create cascading consequences, both positive and negative. Ben's understanding of these dynamics deepened, teaching him that Jedi responsibility extended far beyond lightsaber duels or duels with political foes. It was about shaping perception, guiding action, and fostering moral clarity across billions of lives. His personal journey continued alongside these larger shifts. Relationships with other Jedi and independent operatives strengthened, as they recognized the value of his unique perspective, a Jedi who had never fallen, who could blend strategy, power, and ethics seamlessly. Allies who once doubted the potential for meaningful intervention now sought counsel and coordination. Ben's leadership style emphasized collaboration rather than command, subtle influence rather than coercion, and moral clarity over simple expediency. In doing so, he set an example that would influence Jedi philosophy long after this period. Even as victories accumulated, Ben knew the First Order was far from defeated. Their technological assets, ideological cohesion, and fanaticism remained significant threats. He anticipated future engagements would be more challenging, particularly as the group adapted to his style of intervention. However, each confrontation would be informed by the lessons he had learned. Restraint, moral clarity, and precise action could be more powerful than brute force or intimidation. The galaxy had already begun to shift, and Ben's presence was now a factor that no faction could ignore or underestimate. The culmination of these events led to a remarkable transformation across multiple layers of galactic society. Civilians, once fearful and isolated, found hope. Resistance cells became more coordinated and effective. Former First Order personnel reconsidered allegiance. Independent systems recalculated political and economic alignments. All of these shifts were subtle and incremental, yet together they represented a profound change in the balance of power. Ben Solo's actions had created an ecosystem of influence in which choice, morality, and ethical leadership could flourish. In the quiet of his meditation chamber aboard a hidden Jedi enclave, Ben reflected on the journey that had brought him to this point. He had not only confronted external threats, but also internalized the lessons of leadership, restraint, and moral responsibility. Each decision, each intervention had consequences, sometimes immediate, sometimes delayed, always intricate. He understood that being a Jedi meant engaging with the galaxy on multiple levels: physical, strategic, ethical, and spiritual. His journey was far from over, yet the progress was undeniable. He had become a symbol of what the Force could enable when wielded with clarity and compassion. Finally, Ben considered the broader implications for the Jedi Order itself. For decades, the Order had struggled with internal rigidity, political entanglements, and historical missteps that had allowed tyranny and fear to dominate. Ben's approach, acting decisively while respecting autonomy, leveraging moral clarity rather than coercion, and demonstrating restraint alongside power, had begun to redefine expectations. Jedi across the galaxy observed these developments, incorporating lessons into their own practices. Ben had not only altered the course of immediate conflicts, but also contributed to a philosophical evolution that would guide future generations of Force-sensitive individuals. The galaxy was entering a new era, one in which choice and consequence coexisted with power, morality, and responsibility. Ben Solo, who had never turned to the dark side, had become a beacon in this era, demonstrating that leadership required not only strength, but wisdom and restraint. While threats remained and new challenges would emerge, the foundation had been laid for a more balanced, thoughtful approach to galactic affairs. In the minds of civilians, operatives, and Jedi alike, Ben's name became synonymous with hope, decisive action, and ethical power. As he prepared for the next phase of engagement, Ben Solo understood that the true measure of success was not in victories alone, but in the enduring influence of moral choice and strategic wisdom. The galaxy would remember this period not as a simple victory over enemies, but as a turning point in which the Force itself was guided with clarity, compassion, and purpose. In every sector, from bustling city planets to remote outposts, the echoes of this transformation could be felt. The galaxy was learning to see power differently, and Ben Solo was at the center of that lesson. The future remained uncertain. The First Order would adapt, political factions would maneuver, and the Jedi would continue their own internal evolution. Yet Ben had proven that a single figure, guided by clarity, moral resolve, and mastery of the Force, could influence outcomes far beyond immediate perception. The galaxy's balance had shifted, its currents realigned, and its citizens were now participants in a more conscious, thoughtful era of galactic life. The galaxy had changed, and Ben Solo had changed it. By refusing the dark side, he became more than a Jedi. He became a living testament to the power of choice, restraint, and moral courage. Systems once paralyzed by fear began to act independently. Alliances shifted subtly but decisively, and populations found renewed confidence in their own agency. The First Order and the Knights of Run remained threats, but Ben's interventions had proven that strength was most effective when paired with wisdom, that influence could be exerted without coercion, and that the Force could guide outcomes in ways no single battle could define. His victories were not measured in territory or captured enemies, but in the growth of hope, the awakening of responsibility, and the quiet transformation of a galaxy teetering on the edge of chaos. As he looked toward the stars, Ben understood that his work was never complete. Each system influenced, each life touched, was a step toward a larger balance, one that required constant vigilance and deep understanding of consequence. The Jedi had a new example to follow, a path where power and morality coexist, where leadership is earned through action tempered by integrity. In this galaxy, nothing was certain, but the seeds of a more conscious, resilient, and morally aware civilization had been sown, and Ben Solo stood at the center of that evolution, ready to meet whatever challenge came next.